Alright everyone, welcome back to a brand new day in the studio. My name is Yupari and we're going to go ahead and add the first color pass onto this portrait. So the underpainting is completely dry. So the first thing I'm going to do is just oil it out. So I'm going to be using a medium called Neo McGilp. So I don't even know if it's legible at this point. My medium is called Neo McGilp. I have a little bit on the cap, so I'm just going to use it to apply a thin layer of oil. This helps to bring back the original values that I had before. Alright, so with this first pass, this first color pass, I'm going to start to build the color. Remember in the videos for the underpainting, I constantly mentioned that we weren't going to be painting over the underpainting. We're going to be building onto it, and so that's what I'm going to show you with this painting. Oh, and another tip I figured out recently, when you're oiling out your paintings, I guess this should seem obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me. Just oil out the areas that you think you're going to work in. So usually I would just go somewhat like this, right? And then as the layers would dry, I actually noticed that I had some weird spots on the side from oiling out areas that I didn't actually paint during that sitting. So that's just another thing. Alright, so the color palette that I'll be using today consists of titanium white, flake white, burnt umber, alizarin permanent, cadmium red medium, yellow ochre, sap green, ultramarine blue, and ivory black. This is kind of my standard palette, my standard color palette. And if you want to know exactly what materials that I'll be using for this painting, or that I have been using for this painting, you can always scroll down to the description box below and it'll all be typed up for you. So the first thing that I want to say is that with the first color pass, my priority is still going to be value and drawing. The only difference is we're going to start to build up the hues. We're going to build up the chroma. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the image and I'm going to kind of blur my eyes, and I'm going to try to look for the average color. You can also refer to it as the local color of the model. The local color being the color that everyone has their own distinct flesh tone without too much of the influence of the light. Now there is color influenced by light, and then there's local color. Imagine you have a basketball inside of inside of your bedroom, and you have just your standard light in your ceiling, and then you look at the basketball out in the bright sunset. So the color of the basketball will look different in the sunset, and it will look different in your room, unless you have a really bright colored light in your room, but I'm not going to get into that. So what I'm looking for is basically an average flesh tone, a local flesh tone, and I'm using a combination of all my warm colors. So basically it's the cadmium red medium, the yellow ochre, and the titanium white. And I guess I'll throw in some flake white. Remember, flake white allows you to use more of it without raising the value too much. It helps to create kind of a thicker body to your paint. So that on its own is a little too orange, so I'm going to use a little bit of sap green. So I like to use complementary colors once in a while, so I'll contrast the green with the red. So we're throwing in some sap green. Getting a little closer. The way I'm observing the color on the model is I'm just blurring my eyes. So I'm using a little bit of alizarin permanent now, just to raise kind of the depth of the pink, the warm pink. burnt umber. And I'm just trying to mix this color all throughout the palette. And again, I've been uploading these videos daily, so if you've missed the start of this painting, the start of the underpainting, or the start of the transfer drawing, all of that is on my channel, on my YouTube channel. So just go ahead and just scroll through it and you'll be able to find the start for this painting. So basically, right now I'm just trying to mix the entire, just mix onto this whole thing, and I'm just trying to figure out what the local color is that I want. So I'm gonna go ahead and test this out. I have a feeling it's too warm. Yeah, it's a little too warm, so that's a little too close to the color of a Band-Aid. So I'm gonna use a little more titanium white. Now this isn't really set in stone. I mean, I want to focus more into the values. So let's go ahead and just make the value scale on my palette. Those of you that have seen my previous videos know that I like to use a value scale of flesh tone on my palette, and this is the same kind of thing I did for the underpainting. So a little bit of alizarin permanent. Oof, too much. So tiny bit of ivory black. Ivory black is like a very neutral blue. See that? It kind of neutralizes that color. So the idea is to introduce basically the local flesh tone, and then once this dries, the next color pass will be at the most freedom to observe how each color shape varies in the hue and chroma and all that. We're going to build the colors through the transparencies. So as I get further down in the value scale, I'm going to be using a little more flake white, because remember, flake white allows me to use more of it without raising the value too much. That's why I have flake white. Burnt umber. So I'm trying not to change the hue too much, and I'm going to just basically be trying to moderate the values. But if the hue changes a little bit, it's okay. If we put a little more pink into the nose, into the cheeks, or a little bit more cooler tones in the mouth or around the mouth and stuff, that's okay. But I'm trying to show you my favorite process, the way I like to break things down, and the way that I would potentially teach portrait painting in a workshop. If I were to teach a workshop for a couple days or something, I would break it down into this kind of fashion to make it much easier to develop each individual stage of the painting. So that's not quite the darkest dark yet. So I'm going to clean off the brush a little bit. And I'm using a different brush cleaner. This is Citrus Essence brush cleaner. If you watch the underpainting videos, I mentioned it a few times. So it is it's referred to as kind of a healthier replacement for odorless mineral spirits, but I'm going to be honest with you, that's not the reason why I'm using it. I'm just using it because I noticed it has a very fast drying property. And I want this painting to be dry the next day because I'm painting daily, so I need that to be dry. All right, so now we have our little value scale, and I guess the flesh tone, the local flesh tone, lies somewhere around there. Can't really be sure just yet, but remember, we're going to be building through transparencies. So let's go ahead, and what I mean is that each layer, the paint is going to have a little more oil than the previous layers. And that's another reason why I oiled out the painting, just so automatically I have another layer of oil to work on top of. And the oil, the medium that I used is a fast dryer. So I have a fast drying medium and I have a fast drying brush cleaner. So put all of that together with transparent layers, I should have a dry painting by tomorrow. Hopefully I don't jinx myself, but this painting should be dry by tomorrow. So the purpose is to introduce the hue. we're going to start to build the hue. And we're not going to worry too much if we get the color a little bit wrong. What matters is that we further develop the values. Notice how I'm kind of raising the value a tiny bit, not very much at all, but raising the value a little bit on the forehead. So by doing this, we're actually seeing the layer underneath develop. So we're developing the painting by seeing how each layer is going to build onto the next. And when this layer dries, we'll be able to come back with a fresh eye and develop even more advanced colors. So I'm not sure what I'm going to title the final color pass for this. I could title it something like advanced color mixtures, or second color pass. I don't know what I'll title it, but the second color pass on this, now it doesn't always have to be this way, but the second color pass for me is usually the final pass. The pass where I go and put in reflected lights, I put in very nuanced color shifts. But for that, we really want to set ourselves up by having the foundation well established. So I'm going to use a tiny bit more alizarin permanent. So there are many schools of thought when it comes to color, and all are valid in terms of what their specific objectives are. You can think of a more impressionistic school of color where they build everything through opacity, just flat colors and color spots, and relating all the color spots to one another. That's perfectly valid. That's kind of the reverse of what we're doing. We're looking at the underlying structure in terms of the value, and we're building on top of that with these transparencies. So the frontal ridge of the skull is a little bit over here, and before I didn't really develop this plane change as much. So in the underpainting, I didn't really develop the frontal ridge of the skull as it appears on the photo reference. So another thing I should note is that I work from life quite a bit, meaning I work from live models every week. I run a portrait group, a Tuesday morning portrait group. I attend a portrait group Friday mornings, and then I go to a figure painting, figure drawing group Tuesday nights, on top of all the filming and studio work that I do. So working from life, I know that the photograph compresses, which is not a bad thing. The photograph compresses the values that I'm seeing and the light, and I'm aware of that. So I'm kind of taking that into account with how I distribute these values. Meaning that as the form turns away from the light in this direction, it's going to get darker because these planes are facing away from the light. But in the photograph, this value is almost flat. This value is almost the same as this value on the photograph. So in a sense, we're kind of going beyond the photograph, using our own knowledge of structure. Doesn't mean that the camera is at fault. It just means that we're using a more constructive process, whereas the camera is a little bit more of a mechanical process. The camera is more automated. So it's getting a little darker, just like we had indicated in the underpainting as we approach the glabella. But there's a little more of a drastic change in value as we move down here. And I'm probably gonna change brushes for that. So we're gonna use this one. So it's going to get a little darker down here than I had originally indicated. Now that is pushing it. Now that's pushing it too dark, but that's okay because we're going to come back into it with the other brush. Just try to get this value to be more and more subtle, but still differentiated. So one thing that one could argue with this kind of reasoning is, well, why didn't you just start off with this normal local flesh tone in the underpainting instead? I could have, I could have, but I'll tell you something. So when you see a monochromatic underpainting and you place on the color, notice how I'm building the lights. When you place the juxtaposition of the color on top of the monochromatic under layer gives you a little more objectivity towards the nuances in the subtle flesh tone mixtures. So not only in terms of value, but in terms of hue. So for example, I'm seeing a lot more light here on this side of the nasal bone. So right here on this side of the nasal bone, I'm seeing more light, as opposed to in the underpainting, it looked more flat to me. But now that I'm starting to add on the juxtaposition of the color on top of the monochromatic underpainting, it's like my eyes are opening up even more. And I'm seeing these things, but at the same time, I'm still prioritizing value. And we'll see how in the next layer after this dries, we'll have an even more objective vision of what we're looking at. And remember, the idea is to never, ever copy the photograph. At least, in my opinion, nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with the photorealistic ideologies or whatever. Nothing wrong with that. It's just that I personally, I don't know, I really like old master paintings. I really like classically painted and classical technique stuff. And I can very well tell that, I don't know, if you look at a Rembrandt or something, I don't want to go off topic too much, but if you look at a Rembrandt or Caravaggio, a Bouguereau, if you look at any of those painters, you will tell that they knew a thing or two about form, structure, anatomy, light. So Rembrandt must have known the nasal bone was right here, paving way to a top plane, curving around the side. The cartilage of the nose is here, right over here, giving a more deep tone, not that dark. But Rembrandt must have known all these things as he was developing his own portraits in the past. So rather than relying on copying exactly what he was looking at, I'm pretty sure he was building what he was trying to depict in his paintings. He was building paintings. So I'm going to make this little passage of value on my palette a little warmer. So I added a little more of the Alizarin permanent. So I just wanted to tint it a little bit warmer. Cadmium red would have just been too bright for this purpose, I think. So a little bit warmer. So yeah, we can add a few little nuances of color as we build up this layer, but it's not the priority. Remember, the priority is the value. So now we're going to work our way down the nose. So pretty much I'm seeing that I could still go higher on my value scale. So even higher on the value scale. Now I'm noticing that the color is probably a little bit too warm. So that might be too warm for the local color, but the local color, now this isn't always the case, but the local color, you kind of notice it a little more here, kind of towards the cheeks as the light is turning closer to the dark light. That's kind of where you'll see the local color emerge a little easier. But in the lightmost facing planes, you're really going to be getting the influence of the light. So I'm going to let that be a little warmer than need be, rather than try to dip into my ultramarine blue or something. And then in the second color pass, we'll take note of that. And then we'll adjust it from there. And this is getting a little bit darker. And we also notice that in the underpainting. But since I raised the value of the nose, this top plane of the nose, we're going to have to take note of that with the side of the nose over here. I'm going to make this edge super soft. Now, talking about objectivity when superimposing color on top of a monochrome layer, after putting on that highlight of color that light plane of color right on top of that shape that I had, I noticed something that wasn't quite as prevalent in the underpainting, which is this angle is this shape is too curved, so I might have to push it down a little bit. So I noticed that actually after sitting back and looking at the painting from a distance. Remember to always keep yourself at a pretty good distance away from your painting. Try to keep yourself at an arm's length away while painting, and then back up maybe like 5 or 10 feet from your painting to see it afresh. Kind of imagine it in a museum. Imagine you're painting in the National Gallery of Art or something. And imagine your first glance while you walk past the room where the painting would be. And you would see it, I don't know, 10 feet away, 5 feet away or something. And then based on what information your eye takes in at that current distance, you will walk closer to the painting. So that's why it's important to always sit back. I know it's very comfortable to be right up close to your painting. Trust me, I know the comfort in that. But we kind of want to break that that sense of being right up in front and center with the painting. But anyway, so the cheek right here, this is the top plane of the zygomatic bone. I think that we can push the value lighter now than we had in the underpainting. So whenever we're confused or not sure about any particular value, you can do something like this. Take your palette knife and see how much more room we have to go. So I don't have to worry so much about going too light. So I can actually add a little more titanium white to this little band of color. And we can even compare it right on the palette. So this is one reason I like to have a gray color on my palette. Those of you that have painted with me outside of, or those of you that have painted with me in general know that I use a wooden palette usually. I just like to hold a palette really. But the gray, the neutral tone, helps to compare your values. All right, so see this? We have probably a good 4 or 5 steps further we can go until we go too far. So it's okay to raise the value a little bit. This is kind of an optical illusion, thinking that, uh-oh, that value is too light. That looks like straight white, doesn't it? But it isn't. Proof right there. So having that kind of neutral tone on the palette really, really helps to compare your values to one another. Now, as I raise this value, I start to notice that the other values don't quite sit in well with this value, and this is something that photography tends to do. It tends to overexpose the lights, so it tends to push the lights. So I'm going to be careful not to do that. So I'm going to make it just a little bit darker. Just a little bit darker. But see how that kind of starts to glow a little bit? Starts to add a little bit of luminosity to the painting. So now we're going to get a little darker. Even darker still as we walk our way over to the side of the eye socket. Gets a little darker as that edge gets softer. I'm gonna use the fan brush. So if I seem a little bit more relaxed with this video, it's because I kind of am. So with the value, trying to build up basically from a flat tone, building this underpainting does most of the difficult stuff involved in painting. Not saying that this is not difficult, but having that underpainting, having the values, the proportions, the edges, well, not really the edges yet, but having the value and the proportions figured out, man, it really, it relaxes you. It allows you to take your time and to look at each individual stage. And that's kind of how we felt having that transfer drawing. So it all started off with that transfer drawing. And if you haven't seen the start of this portrait, if you haven't seen the transfer drawing or the underpainting, I would recommend it. It will really help you follow along with this process a little better. So I'm going to compare this plane to this plane. These planes are almost on the same angle with respect to the light source. So I'm actually going to push this value a little bit lighter. And the more you relate your values to one another as you start to add a layer of color on top of the underpainting, the more and more the painting will start to emerge out of the surface you're painting it on. So this is almost starting to look like a realistic, like a living person is right here. Like at least this part is starting to look like a person is actually there. The illusion of reality, the illusion of a three-dimensional thing in front of you really relies heavily on the value. So let's work our way down here towards the cheek. So in the underpainting, we flattened out the cheek a little bit, which is good, but now we're starting to notice a different plane, a whole new plane right there that's receiving much more light. But as a consequence, this area might have to, that area might have to raise in value, which is fine. Simple to do. So again, we're building the painting through transparencies. Each layer is going to have a little more oil than the previous. Yep, don't do that if you're using flake white. But it's gonna be okay. All right, so a little more light right here. Now my temptation is going to be to try to nail this color exactly with what I'm looking at in the photo reference, and I have to keep track of what I'm looking for, and what I'm looking for is the value. And I know that we're painting with color, so it's not that hard to just make it more pink, but the thing is, it just helps to see sequentially. So if you find yourself painting with an art group or working from a model or painting from a photo reference or however, and all of a sudden you notice, what? She had an earring the whole time and I never noticed? Has that ever happened to you? And if it has, good. That's actually a very good thing, because you're seeing in the right kind of sequence. You're seeing the big things, the big structures, before getting caught up with the little things. And for us, a little more pink or a little bit more of a lavendery-ish alizarin permanent with a tiny touch of ultramarine or whatever that we would use for this color is not what we're looking for right now. So this is kind of unlocking yet another level of observation. So we're observing how these values are building. And at the same time, we're doing that with the kind of the unsaturated local flesh colors. So it's going to get a little darker over here, a little bit lighter. And most of this stuff I kind of just learned by looking at old master paintings, or just going to, basically going to museums, looking at Rembrandts, trying to see how they saw. So now that we're working our way to the other cheek, it's going to get darker, of course, because these planes are facing away from the light. So we're going to just take right from these colors, very thin. We're building the transparencies. By the end of this all, the painting or the portrait should look like it's emerging from the panel. We want this to be the art of what it is to see, what it is to observe. A little darker here now. So it's going to be getting progressively darker as we move down. And so it's pretty much, we've kind of got it with the underpainting. So basically all we're doing is just adding a little bit of color on top of it. And little is the key word. So we're going to raise the value a little bit. Right about here, it's going to be a little lighter. Obviously that's an exaggeration, but we're going to take this light and just kind of travel it on down, just pushing this paint down into these little areas. And what's helping the paint move around the way it is the oiling out that we did. Otherwise it would be too sticky. The paint would just wouldn't really disperse as easily. So a little bit lighter now. And we're going to push the light here and sharpen the edge at the bottom of the nose. See how that's kind of just starting to glow over here? I mean, hopefully it is. Can't really know what it looks like on the camera. So again, the value change over here is going to be very subtle, but we're making it a little more prevalent now by the juxtaposition of the color on top of the monochromatic too dark, on top of the monochromatic layer. Now the chroma is going to drop a little bit as we move down here, but there's still going to be a little bit of color that we need to look at. And before we get there, let's go ahead and add a little bit of color onto the bulb of the nose before I forget. A little bit of color there. And it's going to get a little darker as we move away from the lightmost facing plane. Very simple. A little bit darker over here, not that dark. So a little bit darker. Take 2. Yep, that looks a little better. Very subtle. So I painted over the highlight by mistake. So I'm going to go ahead and just bring it back. So the highlight was somewhere over there. So there's the highlight. Now, the mouth might start to give me some trouble again. So let me use a vertical. Now in the underpainting, I pulled this shape out a little bit. And I might need to angle it and pull it out that way. I think Mr. John Singer Sargent said this all the time, or maybe he said it once. I don't know. But one of his quotes is that a portrait is something, or there's a little bit, or it's a little bit off in the mouth, and that, yeah, that's going to be the case here.